The warm June sun streamed through the airport windows as Tanya Brooks hurried toward her gate. Her phone buzzed with work emails, but she ignored them for now. Today was important. She was flying to Chicago to give the biggest presentation of her career, one that could finally earn her the promotion she'd been working toward for 3 years. Tanya checked her watch and sighed with relief. Despite the morning traffic, she still had 20 minutes before boarding. Just enough time to grab a coffee and review her notes one last time. The airport hummed with activity around her. Families dragging suitcases, business travelers typing furiously on laptops, airport staff directing the flow of people. After getting her coffee, Tanya settled into a seat near her gate. As she sipped the hot drink, she mentally rehearsed her presentation points. The marketing campaign she'd developed had already shown promising results in test markets, and now she needed to convince the executive team to roll it out nationwide. Everything had to be perfect. Now boarding Flight 372 to Chicago, starting with our first-class passengers and those needing special assistance, announced the gate agent over the intercom. Tanya gathered her things and joined the line. She didn't usually fly first class, but her boss had insisted for this trip. "You need to be rested and ready for this presentation," he'd told her. "The company's covering it." As she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, a tall man in a pilot's uniform walked past. Captain David Wilson was heading back to the plane after his pre-flight coffee. He barely glanced at Tanya as he passed, nodding briefly to the gate agent before disappearing down the jetway. Little did Tanya know their paths would cross again in just a few minutes, in a way that would change both their lives. On board the aircraft, Tanya found her seat in the second row of first class. She stored her carry-on in the overhead bin and settled in, placing her laptop bag under the seat in front of her. The leather seat was spacious and comfortable, definitely an upgrade from her usual economy class experience. Other passengers filed past her to their seats. A middle-aged couple took the seats across the aisle, and an older gentleman sat next to her, immediately pulling out a thriller novel. Tanya smiled politely at him before returning to her notes. The flight attendant, Lisa Chen, came by with a tray of orange juice and water. "Something to drink before takeoff?" "Water, please," Tanya replied, taking a glass from the tray. "Thank you." The plane gradually filled with passengers. Tanya could hear the muffled sounds of people finding their seats in the main cabin behind her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her pre-presentation nerves. Just then, Captain Wilson emerged from the cockpit. He was making his way through first class, greeting passengers with a warm smile, a courtesy some pilots extended before takeoff. He shook hands with the couple across the aisle, chatted briefly with the older gentleman beside Tanya, and then turned to her. His smile faded slightly. He looked at her, then at her seat number, then back at her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying more than necessary in the quiet cabin. "This is the first-class section." Tanya looked up from her notes, momentarily confused. "Yes, I know." The captain's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The question hung in the air. Several nearby passengers glanced over. Tanya felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks as she realized what was happening. She'd experienced this before, people assuming she didn't belong in certain spaces. "I'm positive," she said evenly, reaching for her boarding pass in her jacket pocket. "Seat 2C. Captain Wilson took the boarding pass from her and examined it with unnecessary scrutiny. "These seats are quite expensive," he commented, loud enough for those around them to hear. Tanya maintained her composure, though her heart was pounding. "I'm aware of that." The older gentleman beside her shifted uncomfortably. The couple across the aisle exchanged glances. Behind them, more passengers were boarding, some slowing down to observe the interaction. "Did the airline maybe upgrade you by mistake?" the captain pressed, still not returning her boarding pass. "No mistake," Tanya replied. "My company booked this ticket for me." She held out her hand for her boarding pass, but the captain seemed reluctant to return it. Lisa, who had been serving drinks further down the aisle, noticed the tension and approached. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her eyes darting between Tanya and the captain. "Just making sure everyone's in their assigned seats," Captain Wilson replied, finally handing the boarding pass back to Tanya. There was something in his tone, a suggestion that he was just doing his job, though checking passenger seating wasn't typically a pilot's responsibility. "I can handle that, Captain," Lisa said politely but firmly. "We're almost ready for departure." The captain nodded but didn't move away immediately. Just want to make sure everything's in order. First class has certain standards. Tanya felt her professional mask beginning to crack. She'd worked too hard and come too far to be treated this way. But causing a scene before her important presentation wasn't an option. She took a slow, deliberate breath. I assure you, I meet all the standards required to sit in this seat that I paid for, she said. Her voice calm but edged with steel. A voice spoke up from the back of the first-class cabin. Is there a problem here?
All heads turned to see a man in a crisp suit standing in the aisle.
Thomas Reynolds, the airline's regional operations director, had boarded the flight for a routine quality assessment. His presence was unannounced, standard procedure for these evaluations. Captain Wilson straightened immediately, recognizing his superior. No problem, sir. Just chatting with our passengers before takeoff. Thomas looked at Tanya, noting her still-held boarding pass and the tension in her expression. Then he looked back at the captain. Something in his eyes suggested he had caught enough of the exchange to understand what was happening. Captain Wilson, could I have a word with you? He asked, gesturing toward the front of the plane. As they stepped away, Tanya exhaled slowly. She could feel curious eyes on her from all directions. The excitement about her presentation had evaporated, replaced by a familiar weight she'd carried too many times before. Lisa leaned down beside her. I'm so sorry about that, she whispered. Can I get you anything else? Perhaps something stronger than water? Tanya shook her head. I'm fine, thank you. But she wasn't fine. The incident had left her feeling exposed and diminished in a space where she should have felt valued. At the front of the cabin, Thomas was speaking quietly but intensely to Captain Wilson. Though their words weren't audible, the captain's posture told its own story, shoulders tense, head slightly bowed. Occasionally, Thomas would gesture subtly toward Tanya's seat, his expression serious. Other passengers were still boarding, moving past this scene with curious glances. A flight attendant from the main cabin approached Lisa and whispered something, both of them looking toward the cockpit. The minutes stretched uncomfortably. Tanya tried to return to her presentation notes, but the words blurred before her eyes. She kept thinking about how quickly the captain had questioned her presence, how readily he had assumed she didn't belong. Finally, Thomas returned to where Tanya sat. He knelt beside her seat to be at eye level. Ms. Brooks, he said, having clearly checked her name from the passenger manifest. I want to personally apologize for what just happened. That interaction fell far short of the standards we set for our staff and the respect we owe our passengers. His apology was delivered, quietly enough to provide privacy, but clearly enough that those nearby could hear that the airline was acknowledging the wrong. Thank you, Tanya replied, grateful for the validation but still shaken. I want you to know we're taking immediate action, Thomas continued. Captain Wilson will not be flying this aircraft today. We're calling in another pilot, which will delay us briefly, but I believe that's the right thing to do. Tanya's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected such a decisive response. That seems significant, she said carefully. Thomas nodded. What happened was significant. Our company policy on respectful treatment of all passengers is non-negotiable. He handed her his business card. If you're willing, I'd appreciate the opportunity to speak with you more after we land. Your experience today highlights exactly why our ongoing training programs are so essential. As Thomas stood up, an announcement came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're waiting for a replacement pilot and should be underway in approximately 45 minutes. Thank you for your patience. A murmur spread through the cabin as passengers processed this information. Some looked annoyed at the delay, others curious about the sudden change. The couple across from Tanya leaned over. We saw what happened, the woman said quietly. That was completely inappropriate. I'm glad they're doing something about it. Tanya nodded her thanks, not quite trusting her voice yet. As the reality of what had transpired and the swift consequences sank in, she felt a complex mix of emotions. Lingering hurt from the initial confrontation, validation from the immediate response, and a growing sense that perhaps her experience today might lead to meaningful change. She looked out the window at the airport activity, watching ground crew members going about their work. In 3 hours, she would be in Chicago giving her presentation. The marketing campaign she'd developed was all about authentic representation and inclusivity in advertising. The irony wasn't lost on her. Tanya straightened her shoulders and reopened her laptop. This incident had tried to make her feel small, but instead it had just reinforced why her work mattered. When she walked into that boardroom in Chicago, she would carry this moment with her, not as a weight but as fuel. The new pilot arrived 40 minutes later. Captain Michael Rivera walked through the cabin with a friendly smile, stopping briefly to introduce himself to the first-class passengers. When he reached Tanya, he extended his hand. "Good morning. I'm Captain Rivera. I'll be flying you to Chicago today." "Tanya Brooks," she replied, shaking his hand. "Thank you." There was something in his eyes, a brief flicker of understanding that told Tanya he knew what had happened. Word traveled fast among airline staff. "We'll have you in Chicago right on schedule," he assured her before continuing to the cockpit. Lisa, the flight attendant, returned to Tanya's side once the captain had gone. "We're preparing for departure now. Is there anything else you need?" "No, thank you. I'm fine." Tanya managed a small smile, appreciative of Lisa's attentiveness since the incident. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Thomas Reynolds, the airline's regional operations director, moved from his seat at the back of first class to the empty one beside Tanya. The older gentleman who had been sitting there had been quietly upgraded to a premium seat in the front row. "Do you mind if I join you for takeoff?" Thomas asked. "I'd like to explain what happened and what steps we're taking." Tanya nodded, closing her laptop. Part of her wanted to forget the whole thing and focus on her presentation, but another part recognized this conversation was important. The plane taxied toward the runway as Thomas spoke in a low, respectful tone. "First, I want to apologize again for Captain Wilson's behavior. There's absolutely no excuse for it. Has this happened before? With him, I mean?" Tanya asked. Thomas's expression turned somber. "We've had 2 previous complaints that suggested potential bias, but nothing as clear-cut as what I witnessed today. Which is why I'm especially grateful I was here to see it firsthand." The engines roared as the plane began its takeoff roll. Tanya looked out the window, watching the ground speed by until they lifted into the air. The city below grew smaller, its sprawl spreading out beneath them. "So what happens now?" she asked once they had reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign dinged off. "Captain Wilson has been suspended pending a full investigation," Thomas explained. "He'll be required to complete our most comprehensive bias training program before any consideration of reinstatement. But honestly, given what I observed today and the previous complaints, his future with the airline is in serious question." Tanya nodded slowly, processing this information. "That seems appropriate. But it's one person. What about the bigger picture?" Thomas smiled slightly as if pleased by her question. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you. This incident highlights gaps in our training that need to be addressed company-wide." He pulled out a tablet from his briefcase and opened a document. "We have a diversity and inclusion program, but clearly it's not as effective as we thought. I've already messaged our HR director about expanding the training for all customer-facing staff, starting with pilots and flight attendants." "That's good to hear," Tanya said. She hesitated before adding, "But training only goes so far if there's no accountability." "You're absolutely right," Thomas agreed. "That's why we're also revamping our reporting system to make it easier for passengers to report incidents and for us to track patterns of behavior." He tapped his screen a few times. "We've been working on this for months, but after today I'm pushing to fast-track the implementation." A flight attendant passed by with the beverage cart. Thomas paused their conversation to order coffee, and Tanya requested tea. As they waited for their drinks, Tanya gazed out the window at the clouds below. They looked solid enough to walk on, though she knew they would give way under any weight, much like the illusion of progress that often surrounded corporate diversity initiatives. "I work in marketing," she said when their drinks arrived. "I develop campaigns that focus on authentic representation. And one thing I've learned is that genuine change requires more than just training videos and policy updates." "I'd like to hear more," Thomas said, stirring his coffee. His interest seemed genuine. "It's about creating a culture where incidents like what happened today are unthinkable, not just against policy," Tanya explained. "That means having diverse voices at every level of the company, especially in leadership. It means creating systems where people feel safe reporting problems, and it means making sure the consequences are real and visible." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "You sound like you've given this a lot of thought." I've had to, Tanya replied simply. Understanding crossed Thomas's face. This wasn't just a professional opinion for her. It was lived experience. Our leadership team is more diverse than it was 5 years ago, but we still have a long way to go, he admitted. Our board is still predominantly white and male. Our pilot core is only about 7% female and less than 12% people of color. And how long have those numbers been stuck there? Tanya asked. Too long, Thomas acknowledged. We've had initiatives, but the needle hasn't moved much. He took a sip of his coffee. Would you be willing to share your professional perspective on this? Not just about today's incident, but on our approach to these issues more broadly? Tanya raised an eyebrow. You want my input? Very much so. You clearly understand this space both personally and professionally, and sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see what we're missing. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing their drinks to slosh slightly. The captain's voice came over the intercom, asking everyone to return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts. Thomas secured his tablet while Tanya closed her tray table. As the plane steadied, Tanya considered his request. Her presentation in Chicago was about helping companies connect authentically with diverse audiences. Perhaps this was an opportunity to put those same principles into practice in a different context. I'd be willing to share some thoughts, she said finally, but I'd want it to be more than just a conversation that makes everyone feel good in the moment, but leads nowhere. That's fair, Thomas agreed. What if I arranged a meeting with our Chief People Officer and VP of Customer Experience? They oversee our training programs and customer service protocols. Your insights would be directly heard by the people who can implement changes. Tanya considered this. That would be a start. And, Thomas added, we'd compensate you for your time and expertise. This would be a professional consultation. This caught Tanya by surprise. Too often, people from marginalized groups were expected to educate others for free, their expertise taken for granted rather than valued. I appreciate that, she said. Let me think about it. I have this presentation in Chicago, and that's my priority right now. Of course, Thomas handed her his card. My direct number is on there. Think it over and let me know. They spent the rest of the flight discussing Tanya's marketing work and Thomas's 20-year career with the airline. He'd started as a baggage handler in college and worked his way up through various departments. His current role overseeing regional operations was relatively new, just 8 months in. It's given me a broader view of where we're succeeding and where we're falling short, he explained. Days like today are difficult, but they also clarify what needs to change. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Thomas returned to his original seat, leaving Tanya to prepare for landing. She took out her compact mirror to check her appearance before her presentation. The face that looked back at her was composed and professional, showing no trace of the morning's events. Yet inside, her mind was racing. The incident with Captain Wilson had been humiliating, but the airline's response had been swift and unambiguous. And now there was this unexpected opportunity to potentially influence company-wide policies. Could some good actually come from this unpleasant experience? The plane touched down smoothly on the Chicago runway. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to deplane, Thomas approached Tanya one last time. Ms. Brooks, thank you for your grace today. Most passengers would have been understandably upset, perhaps even caused a scene. Your composure was remarkable. Tanya gathered her laptop bag. Thank you, but I don't think I should have to be remarkably composed when faced with discrimination. No passenger should, Thomas nodded solemnly. You're absolutely right. That's precisely why we need to do better. He hesitated, then added, whatever you decide about my offer, I want you to know that what happened today will result in real change. You have my word on that. As Tanya walked through the jetway into O'Hare Airport, she felt a curious mix of emotions. The morning had begun with such promise, then descended into an all-too-familiar reminder of the prejudices that still existed, before taking an unexpected turn toward potential progress. She checked her watch. She had just enough time to take a rideshare to the downtown office building, where her presentation was scheduled. As she navigated through the busy terminal, Tanya made a decision. She would give her presentation, the one she had prepared for weeks, and she would knock it out of the park. And afterward, she would call Thomas Reynolds and take him up on his offer, because if her marketing expertise could help prevent even one person from experiencing what she had today, it would be worth it. Sometimes change started with one uncomfortable moment, and the people brave enough to address it head-on. Tanya's presentation in Chicago was a resounding success. The executive team had been impressed with her marketing strategy, particularly how it authentically connected with diverse audiences without feeling forced or tokenistic. As she packed up her laptop and presentation materials, the company's chief marketing officer approached her. "That was exceptional, Tanya," she said, extending her hand. "We'll be moving forward with the nationwide rollout. I'll have my team send over the paperwork next week." "Thank you," Tanya replied, unable to hide her smile. This account was the largest her agency had ever landed, and she had been the one to secure it. As the conference room emptied, Tanya checked her phone. Among the congratulatory messages from her team back at the office was a missed call from Thomas Reynolds, the airline's regional operations director who had intervened during the incident that morning. She had nearly forgotten about his offer in the rush of preparing for her presentation. Tanya gathered her things and headed to her hotel. Chicago's afternoon sunlight gleamed off the glass skyscrapers as her taxi navigated through downtown traffic. She felt lighter somehow, as if the success of her presentation had helped balance out the unpleasantness of the morning's incident. In her hotel room, Tanya kicked off her heels and sat on the edge of the bed. She dialed Thomas's number, not entirely sure what she would say. "Ms. Brooks," Thomas answered on the second ring. "I'm glad you called. How did your presentation go?" "It went very well, thank you," Tanya replied, touched that he had remembered. "About your offer this morning?" "Yes." There was a note of hopeful anticipation in his voice. "I'd like to take you up on it," Tanya said decisively, "but I have some conditions." "I'm listening." "I don't want this to be just a one-time consultation where I give advice that gets filed away and forgotten. If I'm going to do this, I want to see real commitment to change." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Tanya wondered if she had overstepped, but then Thomas spoke. "That's exactly the kind of accountability we need. What did you have in mind?" Tanya hadn't expected him to be so receptive. She had prepared for resistance, for polite deflection. This immediate openness threw her slightly off balance. "I'd like to see a concrete action plan," she said, thinking on her feet, "with measurable goals and regular progress updates. And I'd like to be involved beyond the initial consultation, perhaps as part of a review panel or advisory group." "I think that's entirely reasonable," Thomas replied. "In fact, our CEO has already asked for a full report on this morning's incident and what we're doing to prevent similar situations. Your involvement would add significant credibility to our efforts." They spoke for another 20 minutes, hammering out details. Thomas would arrange a video conference next week with key decision-makers from the airline. Tanya would prepare a presentation outlining her recommendations based on her professional experience in inclusive marketing and her personal insights from the incident. "One more thing," Tanya said before they ended the call. "What happened with Captain Wilson?" Thomas's voice became more somber. "He's been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I've already interviewed the flight attendants who witnessed the interaction, and I'll be submitting my own account as well." "And you think that will be enough? People like that often find ways to slip through the cracks." "Not this time," Thomas assured her. "The evidence is too clear, and the airline can't afford the liability, especially with you being a marketing executive who understands the reputational damage this kind of incident can cause." After ending the call, Tanya ordered room service and opened her laptop. She had intended to check her work emails, but instead found herself creating a new document titled Airline Inclusivity Recommendations. Her mind was already filling with ideas, drawing from campaigns she had developed for clients facing similar challenges. 3 days later, back at her office in Atlanta, Tanya received an email from Thomas with details for the video conference scheduled for the following Monday. The participants would include the airline's chief people officer, VP of customer experience, head of training, and, to Tanya's surprise, the CEO himself. "He read my report and insisted on joining," Thomas explained when Tanya called him. "This has his full attention." The weekend passed in a blur as Tanya refined her presentation. She was used to pitching marketing strategies to clients, but this felt different, more personal, more urgent. This wasn't just about helping a company connect with consumers. It was about fundamentally changing a culture that had allowed someone like Captain Wilson to feel comfortable singling her out. Monday morning arrived with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Tanya set up her laptop in her home office, dressed professionally from the waist up, with comfortable leggings below, out of camera view, one of the few perks of video meetings. She had cleared her schedule for the entire morning, wanting to be fully focused. At exactly 10 a.m., she joined the video call. 5 faces appeared on her screen, each in their own window. Thomas made the introductions. Everyone, this is Tanya Brooks, the marketing executive I told you about. Ms. Brooks, you know me already. This is Patricia Alvarez, our Chief People Officer. Robert Chen, VP of Customer Experience. Diane Williams, our Head of Training. And Gregory Patterson, our CEO. Gregory leaned toward his camera. Ms. Brooks, thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. I want to personally apologize for your experience on our airline. What happened was completely unacceptable. Tanya nodded in acknowledgement. Thank you, Mr. Patterson, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to turn that negative experience into something constructive. That's exactly what we want too, Gregory replied. Please share your thoughts with us. Tanya shared her screen and began her presentation. She had structured it in 3 parts. The impact of incidents like hers on both individuals and brand reputation. The systemic issues that allow such incidents to occur, and concrete recommendations for meaningful change. Training is important, she explained, but it's not enough on its own. People can sit through training sessions and still hold on to their biases. What's needed is a culture shift, reinforced by clear accountability and representation at all levels. As she spoke, Tanya could see the executives taking notes. There were nods of agreement, particularly from Patricia and Diane. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Gregory spoke. Ms. Brooks, that was enlightening. I particularly appreciate your point about metrics, that we should be measuring not just how many employees complete training, but actual changes in behavior and customer experience. Exactly, Tanya nodded. What gets measured gets managed. I'd like to propose something, Gregory continued. We've been discussing forming a passenger experience advisory board to provide ongoing guidance on our customer service initiatives. Given your professional background and personal experience, would you consider becoming a founding member? Tanya hadn't expected this. She had imagined her involvement might extend to a few follow-up consultations, but this was a more substantial commitment. The board would meet quarterly, Patricia added, seeing Tanya's hesitation. It would be a paid position, of course, recognizing your expertise, and your insights would directly inform our policies and training programs. I'd need to know more details, Tanya said carefully, about the scope of the role, the level of influence the board would actually have, who else would be involved. Of course, Gregory nodded. Patricia can send you the full proposal, but I want to assure you that this isn't window dressing. What happened to you highlighted serious gaps in our culture, and we're committed to addressing them systemically. By the end of the call, Tanya had agreed to review the proposal and give them her decision within a week. As she closed her laptop, she felt a complex mix of emotions. There was lingering anger about the original incident, but also a sense of cautious optimism that it might lead to meaningful change. That evening, as Tanya was preparing dinner, her phone buzzed with a news alert. She picked it up and nearly dropped it when she saw the headline. Major airline announces zero tolerance. Policy after discrimination incident. The article detailed how the airline was implementing immediate policy changes following an incident involving a pilot and a first-class passenger. Captain Wilson wasn't named, but the article mentioned that the employee involved has been terminated and that the airline was creating a passenger experience advisory board to guide future initiatives. Tanya sat down, dinner forgotten. They had actually done it, taken swift public action and announced structural changes. It wasn't just talk, her phone rang. It was Thomas. I'm guessing you've seen the news, he said when she answered. Just now, Tanya replied. I'm surprised, honestly. The decision came directly from Gregory after our call this morning. Your presentation made quite an impact. Tanya was silent for a moment, processing this information. Then she asked the question that had been on her mind since the incident. Do you think it would have happened this way if I had been just any passenger? Not someone with marketing expertise? Not someone who could articulate the business impact? Thomas paused before answering. I'd like to say yes, that we would have responded the same way regardless. but I think your professional background helped the leadership team understand the implications more clearly. You spoke their language. It wasn't the answer Tanya had hoped for, but it was honest. And perhaps that honesty was the first step toward the kind of authentic change she had advocated for in her presentation. So, Thomas continued, have you had a chance to look at the advisory board proposal? Tanya looked at the email notification still unread on her phone. Not yet, but I will tonight. No pressure, Thomas assured her. But I do think you could make a real difference here. After they hung up, Tanya opened the proposal and began to read. Maybe this was an opportunity to ensure that the next person who faced discrimination wouldn't need special credentials to be taken seriously. Maybe this was how change began. One incident, one conversation, one policy shift at a time. 3 months passed quickly. Tanya had accepted the position on the airline's Passenger Experience Advisory Board, along with 5 other members from diverse backgrounds, a disability rights advocate, a retired flight attendant, a customer service expert, a diversity consultant, and a frequent business traveler who had also experienced discrimination. Today marked their second quarterly meeting, held at the airline's headquarters. Tanya arrived early, taking a moment to appreciate the significance of being here. The last time she had entered this building had been for their first meeting, when she'd still felt like an outsider invited in temporarily. Now, with one successful meeting behind them and several of their initial recommendations already being implemented, she walked through the lobby with more confidence. Ms. Brooks, good to see you, called the receptionist. They're setting up in the Blue Sky conference room. Same as last time. Thank you, Tanya replied with a smile. Being recognized was a small thing, but it reinforced that she belonged here. In the elevator, Tanya checked her notes on her tablet. The advisory board had made 12 recommendations after their first meeting. Today they would be hearing updates on the implementation of those recommendations and discussing new initiatives. Thomas Reynolds, who had become their main point of contact at the airline, had sent promising preliminary data. The Blue Sky conference room was already half full when Tanya arrived. Fellow board members Diane Cooper, the disability rights advocate, and Kevin Wu, the customer service expert, were chatting by the window. At the front of the room, Thomas was setting up his presentation with Patricia Alvarez, the chief people officer. Tanya, Kevin waved her over. I was just telling Diane about the feedback from the new reporting system. Early results are encouraging. One of their first recommendations had been to create an easier way for passengers to report incidents of discrimination or harassment. The old system had been buried deep in the airline's website and required multiple steps. The new system was accessible via QR codes on boarding passes and in-flight magazines, with a streamlined form that took less than 2 minutes to complete. That's great to hear, Tanya said. Are people actually using it? More than expected, Kevin nodded. About 60 reports in the first month. Most were minor issues, but the data is already showing patterns we can address. The remaining board members arrived along with several airline executives, including CEO Gregory Patterson. Once everyone was seated, Thomas began the meeting. Thank you all for being here today. We have a full agenda, but I want to start with some good news. The implementation of your initial recommendations is proceeding ahead of schedule, and we're already seeing positive impacts. He clicked to his first slide, which showed feedback scores from passenger surveys. Overall satisfaction with crew interactions has increased 3 percentage points since we rolled out the revised training program. The training program had been completely overhauled based on the board's input. Instead of generic videos about respecting diversity, it now included specific scenarios, role-playing exercises, and accountability measures. More importantly, it addressed the bystander effect, training crew members to recognize and intervene when they witness problematic behavior from colleagues. That's significant movement in a short time, Gregory noted, especially for an organization our size. It is, Thomas agreed. And we're seeing even better results from the pilot group that received the enhanced leadership module. Tanya felt a small surge of pride. That module had been largely her idea, drawing from her marketing experience in helping leaders authentically connect with diverse audiences. Now, for the case resolution updates, Thomas continued, switching to a new slide. We've resolved 85% of the reports received through the new system within 5 business days. The remaining 15% involved more complex situations requiring additional investigation. He paused, looking directly at Tanya. Which brings me to a specific case I thought you all should know about. Captain David Wilson. The room went quiet. Everyone knew this was the pilot who had confronted Tanya, whose actions had ultimately led to the creation of this very board. After his termination, he filed a wrongful dismissal claim, arguing that his behavior didn't warrant such severe consequences. The case went to arbitration last week. Tanya tensed. She had worried about this possibility, that somehow Wilson would find a way to minimize what had happened, to paint it as a misunderstanding rather than discrimination. The arbitrator ruled entirely in the airline's favor, Thomas announced. Our new policies, the clear documentation of the incident, and the testimony of witnesses all supported our position that his behavior violated our core values and justified termination. A collective breath of relief seemed to move through the room. Gregory nodded approvingly. This sets an important precedent, he said. It shows we're serious about enforcement, not just words on paper. The meeting continued with updates on other initiatives, the revised hiring practices aimed at increasing diversity in the pilot corps, the new mentorship program for underrepresented employees, the updated first-class service protocols that eliminated subjective, fit judgments from crew members. As Tanya listened and contributed to the discussion, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed in just 3 months. When she had first boarded that flight to Chicago, she could never have imagined that the humiliating incident would lead to such widespread changes. During the lunch break, Tanya stepped outside to get some fresh air. The headquarters building was located near the airport, and she could see planes taking off and landing in the distance. Each one carried hundreds of passengers who might never know how their experience had been shaped by what had happened to her. Thomas joined her on the terrace. Penny for your thoughts? Tanya smiled. I was just thinking about ripple effects, how one incident can lead to changes that affect thousands of people. It's remarkable, isn't it? Thomas agreed. Though I wish it hadn't required you going through that experience to spark these changes. That's often how it works, unfortunately, Tanya said. People don't notice problems until they become too painful or visible to ignore. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching another plane lift into the sky. There's something else I wanted to mention, Thomas said finally. Captain Rivera, the pilot who replaced Wilson on your flight that day, has volunteered to be a trainer for the new program. He said the incident affected him deeply, made him more aware of dynamics he might have overlooked before. This surprised Tanya. She remembered Captain Rivera's kind but brief interaction with her that day. He had seemed professional and respectful, but she hadn't sensed any particular awareness or concern about what had happened. Sometimes people are processing more than they show, Thomas added, as if reading her thoughts. He's been one of our most vocal advocates for the new training approach. Back in the conference room, the afternoon session focused on future initiatives. The board broke into smaller groups to discuss priorities for the next quarter. Tanya found herself working with Patricia Alvarez and Diane Cooper on passenger communication strategies. The challenge, Patricia said, is letting passengers know about these changes without seeming self-congratulatory or making it look like we're only doing this for publicity. It's a delicate balance, Tanya agreed. In my marketing work, we call it the authenticity threshold. People can sense when a company is being genuine versus when they're just trying to score points. What if we focus on the tangible changes first? Diane suggested. Like the reporting system. That's a concrete tool that directly benefits passengers. They drafted a proposal for subtle messaging that would inform passengers of new resources without trumpeting the airline's virtues. The key, they agreed, was consistency, showing through ongoing actions that this wasn't a one-time response to bad publicity, but a genuine shift in priorities. As the meeting wrapped up, Gregory addressed the entire group. I want to thank you all for your continued guidance. When we formed this board, I knew it would help us address specific issues. What I didn't fully anticipate was how it would transform our thinking about passenger experience more broadly. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each board member. The changes we've made aren't just about preventing discrimination. They're about creating a culture where every passenger feels valued and respected, and that benefits everyone who flies with us. After the meeting, as Tanya gathered her things, Lisa Chen approached her. Tanya recognized her immediately as the flight attendant from that fateful flight 3 months ago. Ms. Brooks, Lisa said. I hope you don't mind me saying hello. I've been following the changes you've helped implement. Of course I don't mind, Tanya replied warmly. How have things been from your perspective? Are the changes making a difference on the front lines? Lisa nodded enthusiastically. The new training has given us tools we didn't have before, and knowing the company will back us up when we intervene in problematic situations makes all the difference. Last week I had to step in when a passenger was being inappropriate with another flight attendant, and I felt completely confident doing so. As they chatted, Thomas joined them. Lisa has been one of our most valuable resources in refining the training program, he explained to Tanya. Her first-hand experience has helped us make it more practical for crew members. Outside the building, as Tanya waited for her rideshare, she received an email notification. It was from her boss at the marketing agency. Great news! The airline campaign just won a national award for inclusive advertising. Your leadership on this account has been outstanding. Tanya smiled at the coincidence. The airline she had been working with as a marketing client was a different one than the airline where she now served on the advisory board. But the goals were similar, creating spaces where everyone felt welcomed and valued. Her rideshare arrived, and as she settled into the back seat, Tanya found herself thinking about connections. How her professional expertise in marketing had given her the language to advocate for change after her personal experience of discrimination. How that advocacy had created ripples that were now benefiting countless other passengers and employees. How one painful moment had been transformed into something meaningful and lasting. The car pulled away from the curb, heading toward the airport. Tomorrow, Tanya would board another flight, this time with the knowledge that her presence in first class would be unremarkable, as it should have been all along. And while there was still much work to be done, each step forward mattered. Each policy changed, each mind opened, each person who felt more welcomed. It all added up to progress. Slow, imperfect progress, but progress nonetheless. 1 year had passed since that fateful flight. Tanya stood at the podium in the airline's largest training center, looking out at the sea of faces before her. Pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and customer service representatives filled the auditorium, all there for the launch of the company's new comprehensive training program, Sky for All. When I boarded a flight in first class a year ago, Tanya began, her voice steady and clear. I never imagined it would lead to this moment. What started as a painful experience has transformed into something remarkable, a complete rethinking of how this airline approaches inclusion and passenger dignity. In the front row, Thomas Reynolds nodded encouragingly. Beside him sat Gregory Patterson, the CEO, along with the other members of the Passenger Experience Advisory Board. They had all worked tirelessly over the past year to reach this milestone. This program isn't just about preventing discrimination, Tanya continued. It's about creating a culture where every passenger feels truly welcome, where your team members feel empowered to speak up, and where excellence in service means excellence for everyone, regardless of who they are. The training center had been buzzing all morning as employees arrived for this special session. What made this launch unique was that it included staff from every level of the company, from the newest hires to the most senior executives. Everyone would go through the same training, sending a clear message that the standards applied equally to all. I want to share something with you, Tanya said, switching to her next slide. It showed a simple graph. Passenger satisfaction scores tracked over the past year, broken down by demographic groups. When we started this journey, there were significant gaps in how different passengers experienced your airline. Today, those gaps have narrowed dramatically. That's something to be proud of. The data told a compelling story. Complaints about discriminatory treatment had decreased by 78%. Staff intervention in problematic situations had increased by 65%. And overall passenger satisfaction had risen across all groups, with the most significant improvements among those who had previously reported the poorest experiences. But numbers only tell part of the story, Tanya said, clicking to a slide that showed quotes from passenger feedback forms. These are the human experiences behind the data. She read a few selections aloud. For the first time in my 30 years of travel, I felt completely at ease as a passenger with a disability. The flight attendant noticed another passenger making me uncomfortable and addressed it immediately in a way that was both professional and effective. As a family with young children, We've often felt like we're just tolerated on flights. This time we felt welcomed. Tanya paused, letting the words sink in. These experiences represent your daily work. Every interaction matters. Every passenger carries their history of past experiences with them when they board your planes. After concluding her presentation, Tanya introduced the training facilitators who would be leading the interactive sessions throughout the day. As she stepped away from the podium, the audience rose in a standing ovation, not just for her speech, but for the year-long journey they had all been part of. During the lunch break, Tanya found a quiet corner in the cafeteria. The morning had been emotionally intense, bringing back memories of that initial confrontation with Captain Wilson. She needed a moment to decompress. "Mind if I join you?" Tanya looked up to see Lisa Chen, the flight attendant who had been on that original flight. In the past year, Lisa had been promoted to a senior training role, helping to develop the practical scenarios used in the new program. "Please do." Tanya smiled, genuinely happy to see her. Lisa set down her tray and took a seat. "Your speech was powerful. I could see it really landing with everyone in the room." "I hope so," Tanya replied. "It's one thing to create a program, another to actually change behaviors and attitudes." "I've seen the change happening already," Lisa assured her. "When I started flying 15 years ago, there was this unspoken culture that the crew should always back each other up, even when someone was clearly in the wrong. Now there's a different understanding, that real loyalty means holding each other to higher standards." They were joined by Captain Michael Rivera, who had flown Tanya's plane after Wilson was removed. He had become another key figure in the training program, particularly in working with the pilot corps. "The old guard is coming around," he reported as he sat down. "Even the ones who initially resisted." The data on passenger satisfaction and reduced incidents is hard to argue with, and having it tied to performance evaluations and promotions certainly helps, Lisa added with a knowing smile. This had been one of the advisory board's most significant recommendations, making inclusive service a measurable part of every employee's performance review. It wasn't enough to simply avoid complaints. Staff needed to demonstrate active commitment to the new standards. "What about Wilson?" Tanya asked. She rarely brought him up, but occasionally wondered what had happened to the pilot whose actions had set everything in motion. "Last I heard, he's flying for a cargo company," Michael said. "Passenger airlines share information about terminations for cause, so he couldn't just move to another carrier." Tanya nodded, feeling no particular satisfaction at this news. Her goal had never been punishment but change, and that change was happening regardless of what Wilson was doing now. After lunch, Tanya participated in one of the training modules as an observer. The session focused on intervention strategies, how staff could effectively address problematic behavior from colleagues or passengers in the moment. The facilitator led the group through realistic scenarios with employees role-playing different approaches. "Remember," the facilitator emphasized, "intervention doesn't have to be confrontational. Often, the most effective approach is to simply redirect the situation." Tanya watched as a flight attendant demonstrated how to subtly step in when a colleague was showing signs of bias, not by causing embarrassment, but by modeling the correct behavior in a way that created an opportunity for course correction. It was exactly the kind of practical training that Tanya had advocated for from the beginning. Theory and awareness were important foundations, but people needed concrete skills they could apply in real-world situations. Later that afternoon, Gregory Patterson found Tanya observing another session. "I have something to show you," he said, guiding her to a quiet hallway. There, freshly installed on the wall, was a plaque listing the founding members of the Passenger Experience Advisory Board, with a simple inscription, "For their vision and commitment to creating a welcoming sky for all." Tanya's name was there, along with those of her fellow board members. "We're installing these at all our training centers," Gregory explained. "I want every new hire to see that this commitment is permanently part of our culture." Tanya ran her fingers lightly over the engraved letters of her name. "I never expected anything like this." "It's well-deserved," Gregory assured her. "What began as a response to an unfortunate incident has become a cornerstone of who we are as a company. Our passenger numbers are up, employee satisfaction has improved, and we're now recognized as an industry leader in inclusion." That evening, The airline hosted a small reception for the advisory board members and key staff involved in the training program. As glasses of sparkling water and wine were raised in a toast, Thomas stepped forward to make an announcement. "Today isn't just the launch of our training program," he said. "It's also the 1-year anniversary of our advisory board, and I'm pleased to share that the board's mandate has been extended indefinitely, with an expanded scope and budget." Cheers erupted around the room. What had begun as a temporary response to a crisis had proven its value many times over. As the reception wound down, Tanya found herself back in conversation with Lisa and Michael. "So what's next for you?" Lisa asked. "Will you continue with the board?" Tanya nodded. "Yes, but with a slightly different focus. We're going to start working more directly with other airlines, sharing what we've learned. The goal is to raise standards across the industry." "That's ambitious," Michael observed. "It is," Tanya agreed. "But we've shown it's possible to make significant changes in a relatively short time. Why not aim higher?" Later that night in her hotel room, Tanya packed for her flight home the next morning. As she folded her presentation outfit, her phone chimed with a message. It was from her niece, a college student studying business. "Just saw the news about your airline program launch. So proud of you, Auntie. You're literally changing how an entire industry works. BTW. I'm using what happened to you as a case study in my leadership class. Love you." Tanya smiled, touched by her niece's message and the idea that her experience was already teaching the next generation of business leaders. She typed a quick reply. "Love you too. Remember what I always tell you. One person speaking up can make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is refusing to accept the unacceptable." The next morning, Tanya boarded her flight home. As she settled into her first-class seat, a flight attendant approached with a pre-takeoff beverage. "Good morning, Ms. Brooks," he said warmly. "We're honored to have you with us today." "Thank you," Tanya replied, realizing he recognized her from the training. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Tanya gazed out the window at the training center building visible in the distance. 1 year ago, she had boarded a flight as just another passenger and found herself confronted with blatant discrimination. Today, she was flying home after helping to transform how an entire company approached its core mission. The airplane lifted into the clear blue sky, leaving the airport behind. Below, the landscape stretched out in a patchwork of communities, highways, and open spaces, different terrains all connected under the same vast sky. It was a fitting metaphor for what they'd been working toward. A world where differences were acknowledged and respected, where everyone had the right to occupy their space with dignity. Tanya opened her laptop to review some work for her marketing agency. On her screen was a draft of a new campaign focused on authentic representation. The lessons from her work with the airline had influenced her professional approach as well, making her an even more effective advocate for inclusive marketing. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude. The sky is clear all the way to our destination, and you are now free to move about the cabin. Free to move about the cabin." Such a standard announcement, but today it carried a deeper meaning for Tanya. Freedom to exist in any space without questioning or justification. That was what they had been fighting for. And while there would always be more work to do, more barriers to break, today she could look back at the year's progress with genuine pride. The flight attendant passed by, checking on passengers. "Everything okay, Ms. Brooks?" "Yes," Tanya replied with a smile. "Everything is just fine," and it was.